All right, so my name is Jake Witcher, and I'm, for those of you who haven't met me, I'm a fairly new software developer. As of a year and a half ago, I think, I'm right at about the year and a half, a little past of being a software developer. Prior to that, I had a 15-year career in retail merchandising as a, um, gosh, uh, yeah, I was just as a merchandiser. Had a, had a, it's been so long, I can't remember what I did for 15 years. Yeah, so basically I worked for a furniture company, and my job for 10 of those years was to set up the showrooms. For the last 5, I was a regional manager. So, my work was traveling around and making sure other people were setting the showrooms. But about 2.5 years ago, a number of things happened. I had kind of been desiring a different career for a while. I had kind of reached a point where I couldn't grow anymore with what I was doing, just in general with that particular job, but also within the specific company I was in. And so that happened. And then I had a pretty significant physical injury happen on the job where I ruptured my bicep. And it really meant there were a lot of things I was doing at the time, both work and personally, that I couldn't do anymore, at least until like I got through the healing process. And so one of the things I did in that time was I started looking into programming, uh, partially thinking it might be a career change, opportunity, and partially just out of interest. It's something that I had always thought of as like a foreign thing that you either get early on, or you're either someone from the TV shows where you're like this brilliant hacker from a young age, or like it just doesn't happen. Right, exactly. You type super fast. But my brother was taking a course on SQL, just related to some work that he was doing. And at the time, I didn't know what SQL was, and all he told me was it's programming. And so I'm like, you can learn that? Like that's something you can just look into and learn. So yeah, I had a very fast track story. In about 10 months time, I wrote my first line of code to when I started my first day on the job at Calibrity, which is the company I'm working for now. A lot of stuff happened in that 10 months. It was definitely pretty jam-packed. But one of the things that happened was I got an interview and I got an offer from Calibrity, which Calibrity is a consulting group here in Cincinnati. And we consult on software solutions, cloud native solutions, things of that sort for a number of different clients in the Cincinnati area. Although we have just this year expanded to the Columbus area as well, and we have kind of like a satellite branch sort of growing and getting started over there. We work with some larger enterprise companies. We work with a number of sort of mid-market, kind of medium-sized companies, which happens to be what I'm working on. And just in terms of technologies and whatnot, I work day to day at work primarily in C#.net, and have done quite a bit with Google Cloud Platform resources as well, and managing them through Terraform and getting used to how to do that and deployment cycles and things. So the interesting thing is for the first 10 months when I was learning web development and HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then I got hired for that. But as Tyler was saying, client needs shift and change. And in this case, there happened to be a new client who was really in need of back-end work at the start. And so I dove into the world of back-end software development, found out I absolutely loved it. And that's what I'm still doing now, like I said, about a year and a half later.
Go Jake. If I remember correctly, you gave your first talk, you actually signed up for your first talk before you even got hired, right?
Yeah. I actually gave my first conference talk before I was officially starting. Some of the credit there has to be given to Michael, because I would have never submitted a talk proposal if Michael hadn't reached out to me. I don't remember the exact deadline date, but let's say it was like the deadline was December 28th. On like December 26th, Michael's like, hey, you should submit an abstract to this conference. I'm like, oh, okay. What's an abstract? But yeah, so I'm of the mind that if you're going to do something like that, you talk about what you know. And at that point, I still didn't know a lot about software development. I think I had only been writing code for 5 to 6 months at that point in time. And so I thought, well, but I had been learning a lot about how to learn, because that had been like, that's always been an interest of mine. And in that time in particular, it had became a laser focused interest, because it wasn't just about learning programming. It was about how do I learn it quickly and efficiently so that I can go from knowing absolutely nothing to being hired in a short period of time. You know, I had a great 15-year career with this other company and in this other role, but I was ready to move on, and I didn't want that to take another 10, 15 years. You know, I wanted to kind of start that phase as quickly as possible. And it happened to be way quicker than even I expected, but that was kind of my mindset. And so yeah, at Momentum Developer Conference in 2019 in March, I gave my first conference talk. I had given that talk at a meetup, also one of the Cincinnati area meetups that Michael's an organizer for, Cincinnati Software Craftsmanship. And the talk was just on learning how to learn. And I also got an opportunity later that year to give that same talk at a conference out in Utah called Utah JS. I felt bad because at that point, by the time the conference came around, I wasn't writing any JavaScript anymore, and I was at a JavaScript conference. But you know, I didn't know that I didn't know that was going to happen when I signed up. So, and my talk was, you know, pretty language agnostic. It applied to absolutely anything. So
It was a great
yeah,
talk because that
yeah,
was where I first met you, and
yeah,
like
yeah.
that
That's
that
right.
did not come across as, oh yeah, I've just now got my first dev job like this
Right.
month.
Well,
Like
thank you.
it was really good. So
Yeah, thank you. But yeah, this year has not been so great for the conference talks. I had a couple accepted, but every conference was canceled. Um, and just personally, I really kind of lost my motivation when everything went virtual. And that's something I've been thinking about more lately. And I've actually been trying to think about content creation again. But for me, and I think it was because of experiences of meeting and talking with people like Tyler, and just, you know, just meeting all these new people, some of whom I still am connected with, and some not. But that became a really important part of the conference experience. And so you get that as an attendee. I think there's something really like extra special in a way about going as a speaker, because you have these times to connect with the other speakers that you may not get as just an attendee. And then also as a speaker, like, especially if you're, this is kind of funny to say, but like if you're not as comfortable with just going up to random people and starting conversations and making connections, if you're one of the speakers, people are going to come up to you, and you don't have to you know, always be the one to do that. So from that point of view, like, you kind of meet a lot more people, I think, when you go as a speaker. And you know, depending on the conference, sometimes they'll help with travel, room and board, just sort of depends on the conference and the situation. But I ended up going to several conferences last year for free, just because I went as a, well, free in quotations. There's always cost somewhere. But yeah, it's wonderful. I'm excited for the time, you know, somewhere in the future when we can actually start meeting in person again for things like that, because I really enjoyed it. I think that will help me with the motivation to keep creating new things for speaking.
I'm
Sounds
excited
like
for
you
that
have
as well.
a natural knack for speaking. Do you keep a kind of a running tablature of things that you might want to speak about in the future? A little list of ideas that are kicking around?
Yeah. Off and on. So this year, at the start of this year, I was really wanting to invest more in conference speaking. And so at the beginning of the year, I tried to kind of brainstorm some topics and kind of shotgun them at a bunch of different conferences. And you know, and if you look at different advice on kind of getting more opportunities, like, you see different opinions on whether that's a good approach or not. Like, and it is kind of the difference between like cold calling versus you know, really focusing in on whether it's cold calling, trying to get hired, or in sales versus like focusing in. And I think it's kind of a similar thing. Like the volume approach can work. And for some people, it does work for them. They can say like, all right, here's a bunch of different topics. I'm going to, send them to a bunch of different places, and some of them are bound to hit somewhere. And, but I lately, I think because I've had all this time where just like, I wasn't really thinking about it. Like I've started to kind of think differently about that and think, going forward, I might try to be a little more intentional. And not that it wasn't intentional before, but like rather than sitting down and trying to think like, all right, let's just think of as many topics as I can and let's write abstracts for those. And that makes it sound like I was doing them in huge volumes. I think I had like 3 or 4. It wasn't that crazy, but even 3 or 4 is can be a lot anyway. So yeah. So I think now the other thing too is this year has provided me a ton of new experiences at work, and I think that has also helped shape kind of what I'm thinking about now in terms of future topics. And but one future topic is actually kind of what I suggested to Michael as a theme for this Tea and Tech, which is just the benefits of learning multiple languages. It's something that I have a senior mentor at Liberty, and I was talking with him about this topic because it's something that just over time I became a very strong believer in, and he was like, well, you should write about that. You should give a lunch and learn on that. And lunch and learns are kind of an internal presentation opportunity that we have. We usually have them weekly unless we just don't have a presenter. And so the idea is every week someone at Liberty gives a 30-minute to a 60-minute presentation on a new technology, something they're learning, something they're using for their client, to kind of help educate the group. Like it's on Thursdays, so today we had one, and the topic was on consumer-driven contract testing. Just to make sure I say it. So you may not know what that is, and that's fine. I still probably don't entirely, but at least now I know it's a thing, and what its use cases are, and I know what to reach for when it comes up, and that's kind of the purpose of those. But
it's a pretty cool concept.
Yeah. But yeah, so we'll kind of see how 2021 goes, but if I can kind of craft a nice 30 to 60-minute talk on just the benefits of learning multiple languages, I might start pitching that at conferences next year and kind of see how that goes. And then there's some other things I think that I might investigate. But one thing I will say is I've done this in the past, and I'm starting to do it again. I like to write blog posts as a way to explore topics and to see if there's enough meat there to make a talk, because you can kind of have in mind a blog post, a single post or a series, and depending on kind of how it goes and how you feel about it, you might be able to say like, all right, there's a presentation here. Like I can take this content, and the advantage to that, I'm kind of living it out here. Like the reason I proposed it for this, the reason I actually have a lunch and learn set up on the benefits of learning multiple languages, all of these things kind of, number one, it makes good use of my time. Like I've already put a lot of time into this. So now I'm going to try to get as much out of it as I can. But also repeating that content, you start to learn that content. And in fact, I was particularly excited to talk about this in a discussion forum like Tea and Tech is, because that's not usually what a conference talk environment is, or like it's more of you get questions for sure, and you get interaction, but it does tend to be more like, I'm going to tell you about this topic and you're going to listen. So it's a way for you to actually grow and learn more about this topic you're already kind of interested in and passionate about, because you are interacting with so many more people and getting different kind of responses, and you're kind of refining your craft. You're figuring out, how can I explain this better? How could I illustrate this better? One of the other talks that I had last year was on function composition in JavaScript, and the shape of that talk at the end of the year, I think I gave it 3 or 4 different times, was so much better than it was at the beginning of the year. I especially in terms of how to connect the value of these topics to the audience I was speaking to. Just a lot was learned from just reusing those same things over and over and over again. I probably put as much time, if not more, in preparing for that final presentation for that talk as I did the first time. Like, so it's not like reusing it isn't like, oh, let's just pull this back out. And, there's, at least for me, like there's kind of a continual uh, reiterating, on the talk. I guess I shouldn't make it sound like that wasn't necessarily every time, but definitely I remember that last time, even the night before the talk, I remember being up working on my slides and feel like, no, let's do it like this.
Can I ask a question about multiple different languages and their pros and cons?
Yeah, sure.
So in a recent, we were talking on LinkedIn about your recent post, and you had mentioned F# versus C#, and about how in some ways you could view it as when they both compile down, they kind of become the same thing.
Right.
And I feel as though my understanding of different languages was that from one perspective, the human has to think about them differently. The human puts them together differently, kind of helps you organize your thoughts. Do you feel that there are instances in which it is not the human, but the computer is what benefits from using a different language, meaning maybe it's more efficient to go from functional to object oriented?
Yeah, absolutely. So the last year, kind of my focus on learning new languages was learning functional languages. So I spent probably the majority of the year learning Haskell. I don't usually list that as a language I know because it is such a high learning curve that even now, after I think I probably spent a good 9 months learning and writing Haskell. And even then, if I look at like the source code of a Haskell library or something, I really struggle, or sometimes just flat out cannot understand what's going on. So there is now the basics that are there are 100% worth learning and will completely change like the way you think about programming and problem solving. So that it was not wasted time at all. I am just not a Haskell developer, and would need a whole lot more probably training on some real projects and with some other Haskell developers to get to that point. But F# was another one. That was one, and that one's definitely a little more approachable. And then I'm trying to think, I spent a little bit of time in Elixir, a little bit of time in Elm, but F# and Haskell were probably two of the big functional ones. However, this year I wanted to focus on something else. Like I don't have a computer science background. I didn't know a lot about languages that were closer to the metal, like that had you thinking about and working with things like pointers and memory allocation. And so I spent a few months this year learning Rust, and then for the last couple of months I've been learning Go. And in my very long-winded and roundabout way of answering your question, like those two languages, and Rust I think is probably the better example in one sense, because Rust is going to be fast and memory safe with a very, very small runtime footprint compared to something like C#. However, there's a cost. There's a cost in some verbosity and in something called borrow checking, which is how there's no garbage collector in Rust. It's the way they determine whether memory is still in use or whether it can be freed up for future use. And it is a huge pain. At least I found it, and I think partly why I struggled with it is I was trying to write like a lot more functional code, like passing, like receiving and sending functions, and that's where sometimes it just flat out I could not get it to let me do what I wanted it to do. So again, like there's some great benefits to that language. It is going to be a smaller footprint and probably a lot faster. However, there are trade-offs. And Go, which I've been using lately, if you look at any of my admin of code solutions, it's going to be way more verbose than if I had written it in F# or even C#, because there's a lot of things like, for example, Go does not have a native set or hash set type. There's no way to define a set. There's no functions built in that let you work with like the union of a set or the disunion of a set or other words that I can't remember offhand right now. But working with sets is actually really, really helpful for doing some certain operations fast. And So the way you have to do it in Go is you have to create a map where the key is the value of your set, and the value is either a Boolean or what most people use is an empty struct, which just because it doesn't take up any, there's no memory allocated for it. So you truly are just, but it also means if you want like a union function, you have to create it yourself, and on and on and on. So there's, uh, and that's not necessarily, that's not entirely because Go is a language that deals a little bit more with pointers and things like that. It does, but it's actually in that case because Go is a very, very simple language. Like the whole goal is that there's 25 keywords total in the entire language, because the aim was simplicity. If we don't absolutely need it, we're not going to include it. And I really enjoy writing it, but I find myself writing things that I would never have to write in any other language, because other languages just have stuff built in to do that, do some of those things for me. So again, but however, I know from talking to some of my coworkers, my solutions, even my inefficient ones, are faster than theirs, because Go is just so freaking fast. And I'm sure if we compared like just the overall size of the code or whatnot, once it's compiled down to an executable, Go is going to be like so much more lightweight by comparison. So trade-offs is really what it, and one of the benefits of knowing multiple languages is like if you really dig into one language, which you should, especially starting out, you should really dig in. The first time you explore another language, there's going to be a lot of, oh, why did they do that? Like some things might be exciting, but other things you're going to be like, oh, why did they do that? Why I don't like that, because it's not what you're used to. It's really what you're running into, or oh, that's not convenient. Well, if you kind of embrace it and learn what it is for what it is, and start to like figure out the strengths and weaknesses there, and then you do that again with a third and a fourth and a fifth, eventually you kind of start to it's not so much I like this and I don't like that. I mean, there is that element. I have some that I just like and others I don't, and it doesn't matter whether they're useful or not. I just have preferences. But at the same time, I don't necessarily go into a new language anymore expecting it to be anything in particular. Like there's more of a sense of like, all right, let's see what this is for what it is, rather than for how it compares to where I'm coming from. And I think when that happens, you start to see languages as tools, and you can start picking the right tool for the right job.
So JavaScript's the right tool for every job, right?
It is the right tool for some jobs, Michael. Yeah.
Wow, really? Some jobs? There are jobs.
Jake, a couple questions. So you mentioned that primarily what you work in right now, at least at work, is, you said C#.net.
Yeah.
But you mentioned Go. So like work you're doing in Go are you also doing that professionally, or is that just something you're doing on the side? Or
that's just something I'm doing on the side. So like I said, and most of these languages I've mentioned, I've done on the side. No, not all of them. F#, for example, started out as something I was doing on the side, but because you can create an F# project and then call into that code from C#, and because F# has a really powerful parsing library, and we had a lot of needs for parsing earlier on this year. It's one of those, like, things just worked out. But I had been learning F#. I had been wanting to learn about parser combinator library, so I started doing that. And then we needed a lot of in fact, we had already needed a lot of parsing and had done it in C# before, and then we just continued to need more. And at one point, I think everyone started to realize, like, I can do it faster and more like foolproof in F# than what we were doing before. And so we have so I had a number of F# scripts that I would use for like off the cuff things that we needed. And then I had a couple of F# projects for more significant things. But I actually gave a lunch and learn on this library, and to illustrate the point, there were a few, we took an old kind of outdated and unsupported language that some of our clients' code is written in, And we wrote a parser that translated it into like runnable C# code because they had millions of lines of it. And there was no way to get this thing over quickly any other way. And that is a whole story in and of itself. But certain aspects of parsing that language took us as a team like hours and hours and hours, if not weeks. And after I had learned this this parsing library in F#, in preparation for this lunch and learn, in about 10 hours, I knocked out every single difficult thing that we struggled with for weeks, and had it working like with fewer errors than what we ever got to. And so, you know, it's just like an example of the right tool for the right job, partially right tool and partially just, you know, I had some familiarity with it and with a specific subset of it. But so yeah, that's something I've used at work. Python is another one that you talk about the right tool for the job. Sometimes, you know, again, there was something that I needed to do late last year that I did in C# that was just a big pain. I had to redo something similar this year, and I did it in Python as a cloud function on GCP. And it took me like a fraction of the time to get everything done and up and running. Now, I had more runtime errors, and I had to definitely test to get the thing, you know, a little bit more because I didn't have some of that type security. However, that's also what helped me develop faster for that particular use case. It was building out a testing framework. Basically, we have a very complicated testing situation because of this transfer from the old to the new. Basically, to test, we have to pull the results from an old database with an old schema, and then convert it over to like a new schema, all in JSON. And it's a complicated mess. And that's now all cloud functions. Like you press that written in Python. Like I press a button, and it converts the test data, pulls in the expected outputs, and creates the C# assertion classes for me. And it's like ready to go. So, and Python was awesome for that. But on the actual like backend service, would I have wanted to use Python? Probably not. Like I'm really glad we use C# for the actual you know, microservice, the little suite of microservices that we have, you know, themselves. So yeah, every language kind of has some strengths and weaknesses, and you know, knowing that you can at the very least you can know going into a project whether you're going to be trying to fit a you know, a square peg in a round hole, or whether you've got, and sometimes you might have to, but you know, you kind of know that going into it, or you can know, hey, there's a better tool out here and we should think about it.
Hey, Jake.
Yeah, hey.
How you doing?
Good. How are you doing, Brian?
Pretty good. I was reading an article just to kind of add to that this morning in Toward Data Science. It's one of the Medium offshoots for data science focused articles, and they were talking about how data scientists need to learn more C++ because it's you know, closer to metal, as you put it, language. And they gave an example of calculating the different combinations for DNA. Combinations, you know, if you go up to 13 letters, or if you go up to 15 letters, I can't remember exactly how many combinations they said, but it was like something like 64 million different combinations. And to calculate and get every single one of those combinations, they put the code through C++ and through Python. And it took them 60 seconds, I think, for 13 letters with Python to come up with all 62 million or whatever. And it took them only like 2 seconds to, I think it was like 20 or 30 something seconds in Python and 2 seconds in C++. And then they added, and the multiple just expanded from there. So it was just a lot quicker to do all the calculations in C++ than it was to do it in Python. So their point was, you know, more data scientists for processing numbers and do faster calculations should probably look into C++.
Yeah, that's actually something that's one of the like weaknesses I've heard of Python, is that like while it has there are a lot of great use cases for Python, it's just not one of the faster languages. So if you're doing something where speed matters and you're doing a lot of really expensive calculations, you probably do want to use something else or have a Python script call into something else to do the expensive stuff for it. And you know, and everything else be in Python. But yeah.
There's
cool.
there was a story back in March or whatever when they did the first stimulus bill for COVID, and they were talking about how antiquated the systems were on calculating benefits, and you know how the financial system still runs on COBOL, which is a pretty old language. And you know, why aren't they moving up to Java or some other language? And the answer is that because it can calculate millions of transactions in a fraction of a second. Whereas if you move up to Java, then you have to import a library because you have to import like a fixed point, basically, fixed point library, so that you can get fixed decimals. Because you know, all Python and Java, they all do floats natively, but they don't do fixed point precision with any unless you import a library. So and it's all in the back end, right? Nobody ever sees this stuff because it's just making calculations for who gets owed what. But yeah, so everyone's saying, hey, why don't you upgrade the system to Java? And their answer was, why? Why do we need to? And part of it is how many people out there can still code in that language.
Yeah. Well, and you know, part of the problem with making a language change on big legacy financial systems like that is you have to be exact to the cent or tenth of a cent or whatever that thing, like, and I mean exact in all cases, because off by a penny is, you know, anyone who's watched Office Space knows that's a way to make a lot of money under the right conditions. So we actually had to deal with money on on this like conversion that we did from this old system to the current. So that's why we have such complicated testing situations, because we have to test everything and it has to be accurate to the penny. And in fact, one of the things that we had to do so our C#.NET system would perfectly mimic the old is I had to write a custom number type that, like, under the hood was still a C# decimal, but in terms of how it handled rounding, I had to make it match exactly how rounding was handled in this other system. And thankfully, this other system had really good documentation on that, and a interactive window in the like one of the UIs for working with the language, where I could like test things and make sure it did what I thought it was going to do under different situations. And then then I had to write a so the language is called dexterity, so we called our custom number a decimal instead of a decimal. And so it does a lot of things as a decimal, but when it comes to certain rounding at things, and cool thing is in C# is you can overload a lot of the like the plus and minus and times symbol so that they work for your custom type. And like when you write it, and the vast majority of the time in the code when we're using it, you wouldn't know that we're using a custom number type. It just looks like a regular number. There's just a few instances where it has to interact with some other things that we have to cast it to or specifically cast it to that type or from that type. But
did you know that you can do implicit casts as well, Jake?
Well, so it has implicit casting set up, so that's where like most of the time you won't notice it. But there were a few. And if I remember right, you can only do for certain things, you can only do implicit casting in one direction. And once you have it implicitly casting one way, you have to do it explicitly the other way. Otherwise, it doesn't know what you want it to do, whether you want to turn the decimal into this other type or so that's where like there are a handful of situations where but in terms of like interacting with integers and longs and doubles, like all of that is set up to be just implicitly type. The same with decimals as well. I think it's just when might be when you're casting back to a decimal that you have to do it explicitly. Okay. I can't remember now. It's been a while since I had all that, but yeah, no, I learned some pretty cool stuff that you can do with
that's awesome
with C#, setting that up.
Did I hear you say overriding? Was it mathematical functions? Did you say? Does that mean you can make a minus symbol do something else besides subtraction? As an
Yeah,
operation?
yeah. I mean, you could. I don't know that you could for the native built-in types. I would imagine not. But so you know, and I'd have to look at the code to get into the specifics. But basically,
You
you
don't
create
have to
it.
explain. I was just curious. Yeah.
Yeah, you create a class, and then within that class you have overrides for those like functions, because those operators are functions. They are 2-parameter functions that they're what's called an infix operator, because rather than a prefix operator, which you can think of most functions as being prefix operators, because you say the function first and then you list the parameters, whereas a plus sign, a multiplication sign, it's an infix. It's in between the two arguments, but they're still functions. Like, that's the way to think of them, even when they're just symbols in your code. And so you can override that function to do what you want, at least for your new class that you're creating to override those. And a good example of that is I can't remember if this is C# or this is the bad thing of learning multiple languages. You can't remember what language does what sometimes. But there are, I was talking about sets earlier, and if you want to find like the difference between two sets, so you've got a set of numbers here and a set here, and you want to know what's different between them. One way to think of that is a subtraction. And so some languages will have the minus sign overloaded to operate on sets, so that if I do set A minus set B, I get the difference of those two sets. And or if you think of the plus sign being used to concatenate two strings together, like a lot of languages use that, that's really just an overload of that plus symbol. I guess for anyone who's maybe not familiar with C#, .NET, and Java, or any language that has that concept of an overload. Basically, an overload in those languages is if I have some function, named foo. I know, I'm sorry to use the foo bar names, but some function foo that takes an integer and returns an integer. In C#, I can create another function or method by that same name, as long as the parameters are different. So I could make another one. And it might take 2 integers and give it the same name. So an overload for a plus sign would mean like one symbol, multiple. In this case, if you think of it as just a function called add, you'd have one version that takes an integer and an integer, and then you'd have another version that takes a string and a string, and that differentiates them, even though they have the same name, or in this case, they are the same symbol. So that's the idea of an overload. But yeah, that's actually kind of more common than we realize. We just don't often think about it, because we start to get used to the more like familiar common ones. But
now Go does not have that, correct? It doesn't have function overloading, if I remember correctly, or maybe they added that at some point.
Correct. No, it does not have function overloading. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And I guess JavaScript does it almost to a fault. They decided to have it. Hey, what can we interpret it? Maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but it can interpret all these things, and it became confusing when it was going to do it.
jQuery is the master of that, where it's like, if you ever mess with jQuery, it's like, well, you can pass a function or an object or a string. It all goes into the same code, but we'll just inspect and see what you're trying to do here.
So I guess the idea so I don't use dynamic languages very much. I'm not I just don't have reason to at work, and I really like typed languages. But that is a good point that I wasn't thinking of, is overloads are really important in typed languages, because in JavaScript, you could have a function called add, and you could do like a type check of the two parameters, because you don't tell it in the unless you're using TypeScript, like you don't tell it in the function declaration what types the parameters are. So in C# you would have to say these are integers, they cannot be anything else. So in order to reuse a function name or a method name, you can reuse the same one if it makes logical sense to do so, just using different types. But yeah, I forget sometimes that's not really an issue in dynamic languages. You can do whatever you want.
Sure, just less variables, more variables, whatever, parameters, less parameters, more parameters, pass in whatever you like. We'll figure it out on the back end.
And I forget where I heard this, but I heard someone refer to JavaScript as a really supportive friend who's not necessarily telling you what's best for you or what's going to result in like a positive outcome, but they're just there being supportive. Like, you've got this. This is going to go great.
Let's go swim in that frozen lake. Yeah, do it. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. But again, that has its advantages. I haven't. Python's the same way, and there are times when you can really leverage that to get some things done that you just could not do easily anyway in a typed language. But
So Brian, you mentioned. Oh, go ahead, Jake, please.
Yeah, so something else I wanted to mention, because we've talked a lot about the value of learning different languages so that you know different languages, and that's absolutely true. But one of the reasons I love learning new languages so much is because each time I've learned a new one, I get better at my main language, like C#. Like I would probably kind of consider my primary language just because I use it day in and day out. Like, the things you learn as you're seeing programming from new perspectives and in different ways, you will carry with you into your primary language. And what tends to happen is sometimes your language was not designed to use those concepts and those ideas, and you'll try, and your coworkers will get really mad at you for it, and you'll realize like why that's not the right, why for this language that but doesn't work. But other times you will blow your coworkers' minds when you come up with solutions that they would have never thought of, because they just aren't used to thinking about programming or about languages in that way. So I found that there's this, whenever I'm trying to do that cross-pollination between languages, there's a period of time where I'm just abusing it. And then eventually I start to like get a sense of like, this is what was worth bringing over, and this is what was, but even learning what doesn't work in your language teaches you more about your language. Like, learning where the limitations are and why they're there is actually really critical to learning something and learning it well. That's why, like, in that talk on learning how to learn, one of the things I talk about is directed play or directed exploration, where sometimes you're intentionally trying to do the things you were told not to do just to see what happens, and to see why that's there, because you really develop a deeper understanding of the language when you do that. So yeah, that taking something from one language, learning to another, really a great example is, when I mentioned like the plus sign being a function, the only reason I think that way, like very, very naturally now about those symbols, is because in Haskell and also in F#, they literally are functions. Like, you can, in F#, if you wrap the plus sign in parentheses, you can then follow it by the two arguments, because you can use it as a function. Or if you wanted to create an add function in JavaScript, you would write function add AB returns A plus B. In F#, you can write let add equal the plus sign, and it's already a function that will add two things together. Like, so you have these languages that think differently about functions and about operators, and you learn to think differently about them, and you start to see that in other languages. So there's more benefit than just, oh, I know another language, I can add another language to my resume or whatever. In fact, the truth is, a lot of times you won't really want to add them because you probably won't know them well enough to add, but you'll still benefit, you'll still grow from the experience, from the exposure.
Hey, Jake, where can we find, I'm assuming your talk on learning or learning to learn, is there somewhere online where you can get where we can?
There is. Utah.js was kind enough to record and publish the talks at their conference, and so which is not a small undertaking. I have learned it's a big deal. And so the best way to find that link is to go to my LinkedIn profile, and it's one of my like featured links or whatever. And if you still can't find it, let me know, and I'll but it should be there. I'm pretty sure it's there.
So Jake, I had a question for you.
Yeah.
In your quest to learn different languages, have you found any way to, or any tips and tricks for fighting those first few days of like configuration war with different languages? I suffer from that a lot sometimes when I'm like, oh, I'll just go back and try this thing in Node, and then I spend 4.5 hours like, and I still don't know where this package is.
Yeah. No, not necessarily. And I will say I haven't run into that a ton, at least not with the languages that I've learned so far. I think the one I struggle the most with is Haskell, because for whatever reason, there's just not a unified tool system in that ecosystem, and it just can sometimes be a struggle to get things to work. But a lot of the other like C#, F#, even Go, like their tools have been pretty easy to set up and get going. I do remember you mentioned Node though, and I do remember the last time I needed to work in Node, I did struggle a while with the tooling and the versions, and I can't remember the specifics at this point, but no, unfortunately, I don't necessarily have any great tips on that. But you know, I will say, like, the tooling is actually one of the other kind of interesting things in the ecosystem about seeing a different language. Like Rust frustrates me to no end. I love it and I hate it. And I probably will never use it unless I have to at this point. We just finally reached that stage in our relationship. But I will say the package management system and some of the other like the default way of documenting your code, you can write tests in your documentation and it will run them to make sure it stays in sync with your code. Like there are some tools in that language that are just like amazing. And you know, you can't really carry that over necessarily, but it is interesting to just see how different how the tools evolve around different languages. Mm-hmm. And but yes, I know that sometimes that evolution means they're just frustrating and don't work.
Yeah, I will agree that learning a language is one thing. Learning the ecosystem around that language is a totally bigger thing. You know, yeah. That was one of the things coming from .NET, which I worked in for 4 years, something like that, maybe a little longer. And then coming over to Java, it was like, all right, the language, I can grok this is okay. But then understanding like, so what's Gradle and how do I, you know, see Randy, how do I deal with that? And how do I debug these various errors? Like I'd gotten that dialed in with .NET. I knew like all the different, peculiarities, this is just unhappy about this little thing. We can take care of that. Or, you know, and figuring that out in Java, whereas, you know, it was just a totally different thing. And then same thing moving to JavaScript, where, you know, learning a totally different ecosystem, learning Node.js, learning to hate Node.js, you know, those kind of things have always been fun.
Yeah,
and challenging.
I think you can get up and running in just about any language pretty quickly, especially after you've learned, you know, one or two really well. At least you can in terms of the basics, but there are reasons why some people are just masters of certain languages, and that is just something you cannot do quickly. Like you just have to have a diverse amount of experiences over a long period of time to have run into all these scenarios that lead you to the nooks and crannies of the ecosystem and the language. That's that is absolutely you can't fake that, and you can't get there quickly. That just takes time.
Yeah, it takes some effort. Before I forget and lose more people, do want to say we're not going to meet next week, as you might imagine, it being Christmas Eve. I'm sure some of you may have other things to do with your time. I have some things to do with my Christmas Eve, and so I hope that you all enjoy yours. Also, I recently set up a Slack channel for TN Tech. I think Jake's in there talking about some stuff. Randy just joined recently.
Oh, good.
I think we're doing some talk about Advent of Code. So that's pretty fun. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say. I think, and coming up, don't have a ton of featured guest plans, but Gerald Fulham is going to be one of our featured guests coming up. He's a coworker of mine at Kroger. So,
Michael,
anybody have any
you
questions?
thinking you're going to do this on New Year's Eve, or maybe off for a
You
couple?
know, I'm thinking probably not. I was gonna check that, and then I kind of lost my train of thought. So, yeah, the 31st. Yeah, I think we'll probably skip on New Year's as well, unless people really have a strong desire.
Unless you just want to sit around and start drinking, right?
Yeah, exactly. It could be a very interesting not to and tech. So, yeah.
Good.
Anybody have any questions about the Slack channel or anything? Anybody doing Advent Code? Who's doing Advent Code now?
Right.
What did you think about today's problem, Jake?
The biggest challenge with it, for me anyway, was understanding. I actually had to look this up because I read the problem and I totally understood what the rules were, and then I looked at the examples and tried to apply the rules to them, and they didn't line up. And I thought, okay, I must not understand it. And I went through that cycle for several, probably longer than I should have, before I was like, all right, I just have to. My thought was, are the examples wrong? Like, did someone accidentally?
Yes.
And once I verified what was going on, and that my original thoughts about the rules were correct, I got it solved pretty quickly. Now, I didn't have time this morning to solve the second one. I did get it done over lunch, but a lot of that time was just eaten up by me thinking, what am I missing? Like, what is?
It was incredibly frustrating, like baffling to me. Like, what?
Yeah. So for anyone, for anyone who's either not doing Advent Code or isn't, up to the current day, the quick version of it, at least kind of from my perspective, was, imagine you have a two-dimensional graph, and you've got a picture of its, its current state, and then you've got a picture of its second state. It's unlabeled, and no one bothered to tell you that the graph in the second picture, the indices have shifted. So what was the top left corner in the previous one is now 2 squares down in the next one, and there's nothing indicating to you that this happened. That was kind of, it was a little more, the problem was somewhat more complicated than that, but that was the confusion, was
so
wait a
frustrating.
Minute, why is this not lining up the way I expect it to?
Yeah, if anybody, I can actually, interesting.
All right, now stupid question for your Slack link.
Yeah.
It just pops up and it says, you can either continue with Google or put an email address in there. So, like, I guess I've already got an account on Slack.
That's the
Slack
awesome
is
thing
weird.
about Slack.
Yes.
Is it makes you make a new account for every single Slack group you log in for. Yeah, that
the good
really
news
confused
is,
the heck out of me first too.
If you log into all of them with the same email address, there is a way to log into all of them at the same time. Essentially, Slack was initially designed for work stuff, like, we're going to create a Slack for our company. And so it makes sense. Oh, you have to create a new Slack account for your company, and but the way it's ended up being used is that everyone uses it for everything. And so Momentum has one, and Star Trek has one, and there's one for community organized, all kinds of stuff. Slack rhythm teams, yes, in many ways. Some people love Discord, so I know some people who are totally obsessed with Discord. But
JetBrains just announced, I think officially, I don't know if it's been, I think it's been in the works for a while, but another competitor called Spaces that
Oh my.
it's a similar idea where but it kind of it combines some things that you might find in like Azure DevOps with storyboards and stuff like that with communication like Slack with other things. It's kind of like merging that all together into one product. But yeah, so there's another option out there.
Cool.
Right.
So yeah, and then once you're in there to the Momentum Slack, I can send a link to the channel, but it's just TN Tech. And then now that we were talking about it today, I thought, you know, maybe I make an Advent of Code channel. I can actually publicize that in the Slack at large.
Yeah, we just started one of those at work.
Nice.
A couple days ago. And
Ours
the
has been
rule
going
is
pretty strong at work.
say what?
Ours has been going pretty strong at work. There's a lot of activity in there. Go ahead.
Yeah. Ours is not. We need more. We need more participation. But no, I was just going to say the rule is though, if you're going to talk about a specific day, you do it in a thread, so that anyone who doesn't want to know about it can just not go into the thread.
Good call.
Yeah.
Good call.
But that was actually one of the things one of the first things I posted in that channel was a warning to everyone about today's problem. Once I figured that out, because like I'm gonna save somebody, hopefully 5, 10, 15 minutes, however long it took me to finally like look it up.
Mm-hmm. Incredibly frustrating. Yeah, we spun on that for 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And then we ended up going to Reddit and somebody explained it. And it was like, oh, okay. And honestly, even once somebody explained it, it took a few minutes to grok.
Yeah. I found of all things a post in like an Elixir community forum that was like the first link I found that explained it. I'm like, oh, of all places.
Yeah.
I'm going to bail. Thanks, everybody. Jake, especially, thanks for sharing all
Thank you,
things.
David.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Michael, thanks for letting me be the featured guest today.
You did a wonderful job. It was great. I had a question. Jake, have you tried to learn C++?
No, I have not.
Okay.
I actually picked Rust because I wanted to learn a language along those lines, and
A systems level language.
Yeah, but I decided on Rust instead, just because
I think that was a good
buzz around
choice.
it.
Yeah, and so Brian, you brought up C++, and based on my understanding of things, to you, David, I would encourage you, if you're looking to reach for C++, maybe think about Rust instead, because
Yes.
there's a lot of good reasons to not reach for C++.
If you like, yeah, it's very verbose. I did
And
trying to learn programming back in like 2010. There's the MOOCs were really popular. There was the Harvard MOOC. And they start you off with some like childish game thing, and then you would move on to C++, and you eventually move on to Python, so you could see how language has evolved. So I did do C++ back then, and actually C++, I was like, oh God, I hate this. And I never got through the course.
Gotcha. Yeah, so I actually saw an article the other day about how Microsoft is specifically moving, it's going to be slow, let's be real clear, but they're specifically moving towards Rust and away from C++. So
yeah. I saw the same thing, or maybe like another post of theirs from earlier this year where they just talked about, I don't know if they were saying that they were necessarily talking about that they were personally moving toward that, yes, but they basically put a stamp of approval of like, you really should, if you're doing something new and you should start it in Rust and not C++.
For sure.
The biggest, this is all like just stuff I have read, not stuff I have personal experience with, but the one of the biggest problems with C++ is the memory management and leaking, memory resources. and Rust, that borrow checker that can be very frustrating. And I will say, like, in hindsight, I think one thing I did not do well with Rust that I'm trying to do better, like with Go, is I tried to write Rust in the way I wanted to write, a more functional way, instead of saying like, all right, how do you write good Rust code? But it's
Right.
so
Not
I think,
idiomatic. You got to be idiomatic.
right. So I think I had bigger issues with it because of that than I would have if I had just embraced, how it works. But the frustration you experience with that what that borrow checker is doing, it is flat out never allowing you to leave memory unaccounted for. Like, something in your code at all points in time sort of has responsibility for memory management, or the management and allocation of like specific memory. And it's compile time errors, basically, if you aren't. And I will say, like, it's a very clever way, the way they have it done. It's not as maybe it is complex to use at first, but it probably could be more complex. And it eliminates the need of garbage collection. And so it eliminates, like, I forget where I saw the statistics, but something like, I don't know, 30-40% of like the bugs out there that are in C++ code are all like memory management, like leaking memory issues, that the borrow checker in Rust eliminates that entire category of bugs. So yeah, it's definitely but it's verbose and it has a higher learning curve, but definitely worth looking into.
Yeah, anytime you can move, essentially anytime you can move errors earlier in your development process, you're gonna have better cycle time and stuff like that. So if you can move it from run time to test time to compile time, you're drastically improving your ease of development. In my experience, at least.
Yeah.
So what's Valgrind, Samuel?
You've never Valgrind is a memory checking program for C and C++. So you execute your program with that, wrapping it, and it sits there and monitors memory usage. If you've ever had to use it, it's a nightmare. It's like using the GNU. It's a mess of command line, just flag, and it's bad. But it's really effective at what it does, which is also a pain then, because you run it and then you finish, close program, and you're like, it's like, okay, 2.8 million blocks lost, and you're like, now I gotta find that.
So you're leaking memory really badly. Is that what I mean?
Yeah, one of my first jobs was doing C systems programming, and I had to do a TCP packet sniffer, and I didn't know anything about actual object-oriented programming, so I didn't know how to reuse objects and all this. So I was allocating stuff all over, and no one corrected me. They just handed me Valgrind and said, fix it. Oh no.
See, it feels like C and C++ are like handing people sharp knives and not telling people how to, and not telling them how to use them.
Yeah. C is a loaded revolver with a safety. C is just a loaded revolver. There's nothing left.
The other thing I've heard about the two is that C++ makes it easy it makes it easy to shoot yourself in the foot. C++ makes it harder, but when you do shoot yourself in the foot, you blow your entire leg off.
Yeah. The abstractions in C++ lend themselves to a lot of really bad design choices because they're so obtuse about how they work. Whereas since there are no abstractions in C, you can mess it up.
Right.
That's one of the things that in the blog post I wrote recently, one of the things I talked about was kind of like how to pick another language to learn. And I don't know if I got into it in the article, but when I was first kind of like brainstorming and whatnot, like level of abstraction is definitely one of the things that, I would say if you're used to working with less abstraction or used to working with more, find something that's the opposite. 'Cause that's one of the things that I definitely like encourage is look at the language you know and try to find something that's very different. Going from C# to Java, there's going to be less learned. There's going to be some things learned, but there's going to be less learned than going from C# to Haskell or C# to C++, or well, actually I can't really say that because I don't know C++, but you know what I mean. Like the greater the diversity between what you know and what you go to learn, the more I think you'll get out of it, and the more you'll.
For sure. I mean, I jumped from earlier. UC used to do their intro course in C++. So that was a great introduction to learning how to really program with the worst practices humanly possible. And then I jumped to C, and then my next job after that was .NET, which is like going from bare bones to everything's abstracted. And it took me a really long time to like grok. I'm like, I understand what MVC is at a high level, but now when you're telling me about these filters and this and that, I'm like, I don't get what any of this means.
Yeah.
It took me like a year or two before I was like, oh, everything clicks, and now everything I've done is wrong. Start it again.
Yeah.
I know that experience.
Yeah.
Wow, that was terrible. Why did I do that? I didn't know any better. How could I have known any better? I was learning.
I was just contacting a coworker who had been on the team I'm on now earlier on, and then he got moved over to another project, and I contacted him this week for a quick like rundown of like everything I've learned recently that we did wrong earlier on in the project, just so that he could, I like to share those things when I find them, especially with team members, because I'm like, we all made these mistakes together. Let's make sure that nobody does ever again down the road.
Those experiences definitely taught me the valuable lesson of, especially for like, languages are easy to learn once getting over like the paradigm shifts, but like frameworks are really hard. When someone's like, oh, here's this new framework, you're like, now like the docs are your best friend, but most of the time they lie to you. Angular. So like, it's been fun. I mean, I moved from .NET to Spring, and even that was a huge paradigm shift. And I'd be like, I know I'm expecting the same things to be there. And then I look them up and they're like, oh, it's this slightly different thing. And I'm like, okay, does it work the same? No. Oh, okay. Because .NET has more of that async built in, whereas Java is, with all the backwards compatibility, I've never seen async Java code now working for almost 9 months. I've never seen it in the company.
A lot of it's going to RX or reactive or Spring Boot to, what do they call it something different, but it's essentially using RX.
Yeah,
you haven't heard
the fluxes and
exactly.
Because those are such great terminology for here is a future. Or here is a promise. No, it's a flux. It's a mono.
I mean, RX is fantastic. It's also incredibly challenging to understand, at least in the first, to begin with. It's like, okay, you have a stream of events. What? A stream of events? How? And then, the realization that everything you learned about programming does not apply to this. Oh, this runs, then this runs. Nope. That's not how it works anymore. It runs when it wants to run.
Yeah. I think that's also a thing I'm thankful to about C# is I learned that from using what's the big ORM?
Entity framework.
Yeah.
Entity framework and Link, and like we did some really dumb things now that I've looked back on, like, wow, that was a terrible choice. But we learned a lot about lazy loading and lazy function evaluation that we didn't want to, but we did.
I hate lazy loading. It's so almost always a footgun. And I wrote my first app with it. And yes, it screwed me many times. Thank you, Sarah. Take care. I think I'm actually going to go here in just a few minutes.
But I really need to get going too.
I'm sorry, what were you saying, Samuel?
You always think it's going to be, you ain't going to need it. You always think it's going to be valuable. And then when you finally, like you reach your production stage and you're like, oh, this isn't actually doing anything. Oops.
Yeah. All right, friends. Well, it's been fun. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording, and hope you all have a great week.
Yep. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you,
Merry
Jake.
Christmas.
You did a
Thanks,
great
everyone.
job.
See you all later.
Buddy.